The chamber was silent, yet heavy with the tension of awaiting pain. Its walls were stone, rough and cold, etched with the faint marks of torches long extinguished. The air smelled faintly of iron, sweat, and dust. In the center of the room, a man hung suspended by his wrists, the rope cutting into his raw skin. His elbows were torn and scraped, his shoulders stretched to their limit. He swayed slightly, each movement sending a jolt of pain through his body. Every gasp, every strained breath was recorded, measured, and noted by the clerks and inquisitors who observed him. This was not a battlefield. No sword had pierced him, no shield had failed. He was accused of crimes real or imagined, sins whispered in corridors of power, offenses that demanded the public assertion of authority. The chroniclers would remember him not for his name, not for his life, but for the marks on his flesh and the confession he might be forced to give. His body had become a ledger, a document of suffering, written in bruises, dislocations, and fractured bones. Across Europe, this scene was repeated in dungeons, chambers, and public halls. Today, archaeologists uncover evidence of these punishments. Skeletons exhumed from cemeteries near medieval cities reveal repeated trauma. Shoulder injuries, clavicle scars, rib fractures. These injuries are not accidents. They match what historians find in Inquisition manuals. Manuals describe straps and ropes, knots and bindings, designed to stretch the body painfully without causing immediate death. Torturers were methodical, precise, and terrifyingly knowledgeable. They knew which positions caused nerve damage, which tore tendons, which produced screams loud enough to echo through corridors and hallways, ensuring both pain and fear were felt by witnesses. Suspension served multiple purposes. It inflicted pain, yes, but it was also a tool of control and authority. Officials observed, timed, and documented. They measured responses, adjusted knots, and manipulated ropes. The victim's suffering was predictable, repeatable, and useful. Clerks wrote every detail: the time the accused hung, the shape of the wounds, the strength of the screams. Each record was intended to legitimize the punishment, transforming human suffering into legal evidence. This was the machinery of medieval justice, a system where pain was as much a tool of administration as a weapon of coercion. Chroniclers such as Jean Froissart described these acts with precision. They wrote of men and women whose bodies were bent and stretched, whose cries filled the air and warned the onlookers. The public nature of such torture was part of its power. The suspended body was a lesson. It taught fear, obedience, and the reach of law. Even the walls of the dungeons, rough and stone-bound, were participants. Every scrape and echo carried the message that authority was absolute. Suspension did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader system that included branding, flogging, and fire-based punishments. Archaeological evidence shows that these techniques often targeted both body and social identity. Branding, for instance, left permanent marks that were impossible to hide. A man's confession might be extracted under the rope, but his branded shoulder or chest carried the proof beyond the courtroom into society itself. Social stigma accompanied physical injury, binding body and reputation together in a single narrative of control. Even within the chamber, the psychological effects were deliberate. The victim's isolation, the constant awareness of observers, and the anticipation of further pain created a mental strain as powerful as the physical torment. Historical records describe victims who begged for mercy, who repeated confessions they had not yet made simply to end the suspended agony. Pain and fear worked in tandem. One reinforced the other, ensuring the machinery of law functioned efficiently. The rope itself became an instrument of calculation. Officials knew how long a body could be suspended before permanent injury occurred. They experimented with positions to maximize discomfort while preserving life for further testimony. In Italy, the term strappardo referred to a suspension technique designed to stretch arms upward while the weight of the body pulled at shoulders and elbows. Skeletal remains recovered from execution yards show healed injuries consistent with this technique. Avulsion fractures, shoulder instability, and signs of nerve damage that could last a lifetime. These physical traces confirm the written manuals, creating a bridge between material evidence and historical narrative. From Spain to France, Italy to the Low Countries, such punishments were standardized. Municipal inventories list ropes, beams, straps, and iron fittings, showing that torture was a planned and budgeted part of civic and religious administration. Officials paid for repairs, oiling of ropes, and replacement of worn equipment. The machinery of violence was woven into daily life, funded and maintained as any other tool of government. But the suspended man was more than a mechanical instrument. He was also a symbol. His pain demonstrated the consequences of resistance. His bruises and dislocations were messages written for the community, teaching obedience and warning of the reach of law. Chroniclers documented these stories not merely as reports of cruelty, but as examples of civic authority, demonstrating that justice could bend and control even the strongest bodies. Even centuries later, these events resonate. Archaeologists and osteologists uncover traces of trauma, confirming the accounts of chroniclers. The pattern is consistent, systematic, intentional, and horrifyingly effective. The combination of observation, documentation, and carefully applied suffering ensured that suspension served both practical and symbolic purposes. Victims survived in many cases, but their bodies carried scars that lasted a lifetime. Some confessions obtained under duress were false, some truths extracted were real. Yet in every case, the goal was clear. Authority required visible proof of power. The man on the rope, dangling in the stone chamber, was more than a single victim. He was a representative of countless lives subjected to a system designed to extract obedience through pain. His struggle was immediate and agonizing, but it also shaped law, governance, and social order. Suspension was not merely punishment. It was a tool of administration, a method to convert human suffering into recorded proof and social control. And so, the rope swayed, the chroniclers wrote, and the history of human pain was etched into both flesh and parchment. This story, repeated across centuries and regions, reminds us that punishment in the Middle Ages was calculated, deliberate, and deeply intertwined with the structures of power. The suspended man's agony was the first chapter in a long, dark history of coercion, control, and the ways societies turned human bodies into instruments of law. Beyond the dimly lit chambers where men and women hung by ropes, another method of punishment took shape: mechanical, deliberate, and terrifyingly efficient. This was the rack, a device designed not merely to hurt, but to stretch, dislocate, and dominate the human body. Unlike suspension, which relied on gravity and ropes, the rack was engineered with levers, gears, and frames, turning pain into a controlled and repeatable science. In towns across medieval Europe, from fortified administrative compounds to municipal dungeons, officials maintained records of such instruments. Iron fittings and wooden frames unearthed by archaeologists correspond closely to descriptions in 15th-century inventories. These inventories list large wheels, twisting frames, and iron chains designed to restrain, bind, and extend limbs. Craftsmen were paid to construct these devices, sometimes specifying the dimensions, iron thickness, and even the degree of leverage to be applied. Torture had become both a science and an art, meticulously planned to produce predictable injury. The mechanics of the rack were simple yet horrifying. The victim was tied by wrists and ankles, stretched across the wooden frame. Levers were turned slowly, pulling arms and legs in opposite directions. Tendons strained, joints dislocated, and the body screamed in ways that echoed off stone walls. Forensic studies of skeletons from prison sites near Cologne revealed displaced ribs, elongated bones, and vertebral compression consistent with such traction devices. Each skeleton tells a silent story, confirming the manuals and chroniclers who described breaking on the wheel or the rack in excruciating detail. Legal and administrative motivations shaped the use of the rack. Inquisitors and municipal authorities did not merely want to hurt, they wanted to extract confessions. The rack allowed interrogators to escalate pain incrementally, controlling both duration and intensity. Trial transcripts from northern French towns in the 15th century include detailed accounts. Officials would note how long a suspect could endure, which joints were vulnerable, and when to pause to prevent death. The apparatus itself became a record of legal procedure, a tangible manifestation of law meeting flesh. This mechanical precision distinguished the rack from older forms of corporal punishment, such as flogging or the strapardo. Suspension relied on human observation and basic physics, but the rack introduced standardization. Officials could ensure that anyone placed upon the device would experience roughly the same level of injury and agony. This predictability was valuable not only for interrogation, but also for legal and social legitimacy. If a confession was obtained, it could be defended in court. If a death occurred, records demonstrated that the procedure followed municipal or inquisitorial regulations. Chroniclers of the times, such as Jean Frassard, wrote of the breaking wheel and the rack in campaigns of judicial terror. They described how limbs were dislocated and joints torn, often with precise timing that allowed the victim to survive long enough to confess or demonstrate compliance. Municipal statutes, like those compiled in the Germania Historica, explicitly forbade killing by torture while enumerating the permissible instruments. Officials were acutely aware that legal legitimacy required balancing terror with survival. Archaeological evidence corroborates these texts. Iron fittings found in the remains of dungeons match the descriptions of racks used in late medieval Europe. Skeletal remains reveal not only fractures, but also patterns of healing that indicate repeated use or survival after extreme injury. Some skeletons show avulsion fractures in shoulders, rib displacement, and healed injuries to the vertebrae. These injuries align with the controlled application of the rack. The body could be broken in ways that caused lasting damage, but allowed the victim to live. The rack also marked the evolution of punishment into administrative control. Municipal accounts from 1472 list payments to craftsmen for constructing large wheels and torturing frames. These were not ad hoc instruments. They were maintained, repaired, and insured as part of civic infrastructure. Just as the town maintained roads, markets, and walls, it maintained devices of torture. The ritualization of the rack extended beyond the walls of the dungeon. Public awareness of such devices, combined with chroniclers' accounts, spread fear and reinforced authority across entire regions. The social consequences were deliberate. Victims survived, but their bodies carried the marks of official power. Dislocated shoulders, stretched joints, and broken limbs were visible proof of obedience enforced by pain. Families and communities could see the cost of defiance. The spectacle was both legal and performative. By using a standardized device, authorities demonstrated that punishment was measured, lawful, and backed by civic or ecclesiastical power. Even within the medical and forensic understanding of the time, the rack represented an early form of applied anatomy. Torturers understood the human skeleton well enough to know which joints could be safely stretched, which tendons tore first, and how to manipulate the body to produce maximum pain without immediate death. Later, physicians and surgeons would record complications, nerve damage, chronic shoulder instability, and infections resulting from tissue trauma. Yet in the medieval context, these outcomes were often secondary concerns. The primary objective remained confession, compliance, and the assertion of power. The rack's introduction also influenced other methods of punishment. Devices like iron rods, thumb screws, and compression tools emerged in response to the same desire: controlled, repeatable suffering. Municipal inventories list these instruments alongside racks, suggesting a coordinated strategy. Each device had its function, targeting specific body parts or producing a particular type of injury. The evolution of the rack thus marks a turning point in medieval punishment, from ad hoc violence to a systematic, bureaucratically managed mechanism of coercion. In essence, the rack transformed torture into an instrument of governance. Pain became measurable, predictable, and documentable. Officials could justify its use not only as punishment, but as a legal and social necessity. Confessions obtained under the rack were codified, recorded, and preserved, creating a bureaucratic archive of suffering. Victims carried scars as enduring testimony, but the written records ensured that the authority of the state persisted long after the physical event. Even centuries later, the legacy of the rack is evident in both skeletal remains and historical accounts. Archaeologists and osteologists continue to uncover evidence of its use, confirming the meticulous detail found in manuals and chroniclers. The machine's impact extended beyond individual bodies, shaping social order, legal practice, and administrative culture across Europe. The rack was more than a device. It was a symbol of the calculated, systematic nature of medieval justice, a grim intersection of anatomy, law, and power. The man who had once swung by ropes could not yet imagine the innovation of mechanical devices. His suspension was a prelude, a starting point in a growing toolkit of instruments designed to control, extract, and terrify. The rack and its derivatives would become the standard, the benchmark against which the efficacy of all other methods was measured. And so, the story of torture continued, evolving from simple ropes and straps to complex machines that bent, broke, and constrained the human body. The lessons of the rack would ripple through towns, dungeons, and courts, leaving evidence in both archives and skeletons, teaching a generation that human pain could be measured, administered, and recorded in the name of justice.
In the courtyards and chambers of medieval towns, fire was never merely a source of warmth or light. It was a weapon, a judge, and a recorder of guilt. Branding irons glowed red in the hearth, their shapes forged to leave letters, symbols, or marks upon the flesh of those accused. Fire could burn flesh, scar skin, and leave permanent evidence of crime, a punishment that was both physical and social, affecting body, family, and community alike. The man who had once swung by ropes or been stretched on the rack might next face the glowing tip of an iron. Chroniclers describe how accused individuals were pressed against the metal, leaving their skin seared, their cries echoing against stone walls. Archaeological evidence confirms these practices. Bones recovered from medieval burial sites in Spain and Italy show healed burn marks and patterns of tissue calcification consistent with branding.
Some skeletons preserve traces of heat exposure on ribs or forearms, suggesting that fire was applied not only for punishment but for intimidation, sometimes as a warning to onlookers. Branding served multiple purposes. The first was immediate pain, sharp and undeniable. The second was permanence. Unlike suspension or the rack, which could heal and leave scars visible only to trained eyes, branding etched guilt onto the skin itself. The mark was evidence that could be shown in courts, in markets, or on the streets. A branded shoulder, hand, or forehead was a warning to neighbors, a visual proof of submission to authority. Municipal statutes often required public exposure of the mark, blending punishment with spectacle. The body became both evidence and lesson. The social consequences were deliberate. Families carried the shame of branded members. Communities recognized the punishment as a warning, learning that defiance invited visible, lasting pain. Written inventories and municipal accounts from 15th century towns list branding irons of various shapes, letters, symbols, and emblems for different crimes. Craftsmen were paid to forge these tools precisely, sometimes with inscriptions indicating the crime or status of the victim. Branding was therefore both punishment and communication, extending authority beyond the individual to the wider social sphere. Fire was also framed as moral and religious purification. Ecclesiastical texts describe branding as a method to cleanse sin, particularly in cases of heresy or witchcraft. The red iron was not only an instrument of justice, but a symbolic medium, transforming physical suffering into a ritual of penitence. Witch trial manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum from 1487 record similar practices, instructing inquisitors on the use of heated implements to produce confessions or demonstrate guilt. In these records, pain is intertwined with ideology. The body suffers, but the soul is claimed to benefit, or so the authorities argued. Archaeological and osteological evidence corroborates these accounts. Burn scars on skeletal remains align with documented locations of branding: hands, forearms, and shoulders. Sometimes the marks were repeated or healed unevenly, indicating survival after multiple applications. These injuries were not accidental. Officials knew where to apply the heat for maximum effect, how long to hold it, and when to stop to preserve life while ensuring lasting evidence. In a sense, the body became both canvas and witness. The practice of branding also intersected with other forms of punishment. A person who had been suspended or racked might later be branded, compounding pain and creating layered evidence of guilt. Chroniclers and legal documents describe how judges combined methods: first suspension to extract confession, then branding to create permanent proof. Each act was calculated, forming part of a procedural logic that extended beyond immediate violence. Pain, fear, and social marking became a deliberate chain of consequence. Fire-based punishments evolved further. Beyond branding, authorities experimented with heated irons, stoves, and occasionally boiling liquids to terrorize or interrogate. Medical accounts from the period describe complications, infections, blistering, and long-term disability. Ecclesiastical and civic authorities debated the limits of such punishment, sometimes limiting branding to non-lethal applications to preserve legal legitimacy. Yet the line between torment and death remained precarious. Burn injuries could easily become fatal, and some victims did not survive. The administration of fire required skill, oversight, and documentation, turning torture into a procedural science. The spectacle of fire extended beyond the dungeon. Public punishments included exposing branded victims, parading them through towns, or displaying marks during markets. Municipal records often note the scheduling of such events, emphasizing visibility and communal reinforcement of law. The authorities recognized that fire was not only an instrument of injury, but a tool to communicate authority. A branded individual was a warning, an illustration of what resistance, theft, or heresy could bring. In this way, fire and branding served both legal and performative functions. Branding also influenced identity and memory. A burned mark was permanent, distinguishing the punished for life. Families remembered it, communities referred to it, legal systems used it as ongoing evidence of guilt. In some cases, repeated branding or extreme heat exposure could affect a person's ability to work or participate in civic life, extending punishment into economic and social dimensions. Archaeologists find evidence of this in burial patterns. Branded individuals are sometimes segregated or placed in peripheral cemeteries, confirming social exclusion. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical. Fear of fire, anticipation of pain, and the knowledge that the mark was permanent created compliance and terror. Victims were often forced to confess before the iron, their bodies and voices intertwined in testimony. Some wrote statements or repeated confessions while suffering. Others broke under the threat alone. The manipulation of perception, combined with physical pain, reveals an emerging understanding of psychological control in medieval jurisprudence. As fire and branding became more common, manuals, inventories, and correspondence codified their use. Legal and ecclesiastical authorities instructed which crimes warranted branding, the appropriate instruments, and the manner of application. In this way, punishment became standardized, predictable, and administratively manageable. Burn marks were no longer accidents, they were deliberate, bureaucratic outcomes, linking the physical and the social into one enduring record of authority. Even centuries later, the evidence remains. Burned bones, skeletal markers, and municipal accounts converge to tell a consistent story. Fire was a tool of pain, proof, and communication. It transformed the body into a witness, the mark into testimony, and the suffering into social and legal control. Branding, like the rack and suspension, demonstrates how medieval authorities combined physical punishment, administrative logic, and social pedagogy to enforce obedience and maintain hierarchy. The evolution of fire-based punishment also foreshadowed further innovations. As officials refined the use of branding, they experimented with heat, liquids, and ceremonial methods to maximize psychological terror. The ritualization of pain, the integration of spectacle, and the blending of moral justification with coercion reveal a legal culture increasingly concerned with control, visibility, and reproducibility. In the medieval imagination, fire could cleanse, punish, and display simultaneously. The victim's body was both instrument and record. Each burn, each scar was a lesson written for witnesses and recorded for officials. Branding ensured that guilt was visible, traceable, and socially legible. It was a continuation of the logic of suspension and the rack. Pain made precise, testimony made tangible, authority made undeniable. Thus, the story of fire and brand is not merely one of physical suffering. It is a story of law, society, and control. Pain, documentation, and social visibility merged into a system in which the body became a permanent archive of authority.
The man who had once hung by ropes then felt the rack's unyielding stretch might next face fire. Each stage of suffering connected, calculated, and recorded. The flames left scars on flesh, bones, and memory alike, forging the medieval vision of punishment as both instrument and spectacle. The streets of medieval towns were more than pathways and marketplaces. They were theaters of power, stages on which authority displayed itself in flesh and fear. Public punishments were carefully orchestrated spectacles designed to instill obedience, assert dominance, and broadcast the consequences of crime. In these displays, the individual body became a vessel of law, morality, and communal memory, a warning etched not only on skin, but into the minds of witnesses. Among the earliest forms of public humiliation were devices designed to restrain and expose: stocks, pillories, and iron collars. Parish records and municipal statutes detail how offenders were secured in the town square, their hands and feet trapped, their bodies exposed to the gaze of neighbors. The devices themselves varied. Wooden stocks bound the ankles and wrists, forcing the accused to sit or kneel in discomfort. Iron collars clamped around the neck, immobilizing and branding simultaneously. Chroniclers describe the crowd gathering, jeering, throwing refuse, and observing the pain with a mix of curiosity and caution. These punishments were not arbitrary. They were codified in law and intentionally public, serving as visual affirmations of the power of the state and church. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Skeletons exhumed from urban graveyards sometimes display healed perimortem injuries consistent with repeated use of restraint devices. Osteoarchaeologists identify periosteal changes around the wrists and neck, marks left by iron or wooden confinement over prolonged periods. In some cases, healed fractures of the hands indicate the chronic discomfort or occasional violence endured while immobilized. These traces confirm that public shaming left lasting physical consequences, even when intended primarily for visibility rather than lethal effect. The logic behind public punishment was strategic. Authorities understood that terror functioned best when it was observable and social. The suffering of one became the warning for many. Municipal ledgers note expenditures for maintaining stocks, painting iron collars, and repairing devices after use. Fiscal investment underscores the importance assigned to these displays. Punishment was not simply a response to crime. It was a civic spectacle, a lesson for the community. Shame extended beyond the immediate physical punishment. Legal texts describe additional layers of humiliation: parading the accused through town, attaching signs detailing crimes, or forcing confessions aloud before crowds. Ecclesiastical courts emphasized moral correction, while secular authorities highlighted civic compliance. The blending of spectacle and legal procedure illustrates a sophisticated understanding of psychology. Public embarrassment amplified compliance, deterred future offenses, and reinforced hierarchy. In some cases, the consequences were lifelong. Individuals exposed in stocks or collars often returned home marked by both injury and social stigma. Families could be shamed alongside the punished, excluded from certain trades, or barred from civic participation. Archaeologists note peripheral burials of executed or humiliated individuals, consistent with written records indicating social exclusion. The law, physical punishment, and societal memory intertwined, demonstrating that medieval justice extended beyond immediate pain into enduring social control. Public spectacle was not limited to restraint devices. More extreme punishments were designed to terrify as well as injure. The breaking wheel, previously mentioned in the context of mechanical torture, was sometimes employed publicly, its victims stretched, dislocated, and displayed while alive.
Chroniclers like Froissart described the slow rotation and systematic fracturing of limbs, emphasizing both agony and the demonstration of legal authority. Municipal accounts record payments for the construction of wheels and scaffolds, ensuring that punishment could be witnessed by the largest possible audience. This spectacle served dual purposes: extracting confessions and instilling fear that would ripple across the population. Legal and administrative records reveal careful regulation of public punishments. Statutes specified not only which crimes warranted exposure or mutilation, but also how long individuals should remain restrained, the exact devices to be used, and the proper conduct of officials. Executioners and municipal officers received training to ensure punishments were neither arbitrary nor lethal beyond intent. The public ritual of punishment was in effect a form of state theater, combining precision, terror, and legality into a single performative act. The combination of physical, psychological, and social pressure was strikingly effective. Witnesses learned quickly that resistance could result in prolonged pain, permanent injury, social ostracism, and family dishonor. Victims internalized these lessons, often providing confessions under minimal additional coercion simply to end their exposure. The cumulative effect was to reinforce authority while creating an archive of behavior, demonstrating the medieval administration's deep understanding of power, psychology, and spectacle. Shame devices evolved over time. Stocks and collars gave way to more elaborate constructions, sometimes combining suspension, restraint, and public exposure. Chronicles note individuals confined in cages or gibbets, hung from public squares or city walls for days. Osteological evidence, while limited, shows peri-mortem bone trauma and pressure marks consistent with prolonged confinement in these devices. The goal was not only injury, but visibility, ensuring that the body communicated the law even after the individual could no longer speak. These public punishments were deeply intertwined with legal procedure. Municipal and inquisitorial records detail step-by-step protocols: arrest, restraint, interrogation, exposure, and finally, release or execution. Confessions obtained during public humiliation were documented, often recorded alongside the maintenance logs of the devices themselves. The bureaucratic integration of torture, public spectacle, and record-keeping created a feedback loop. Visible suffering legitimized authority, while documentation preserved the procedural correctness of each act. The social consequences extended beyond the individual. Communities internalized fear, learning not only the consequences of crime, but the reach of law into private and public life. Families bore shame, trades could be affected, and social mobility restricted. Public punishments were a tool for civic education, a reminder that compliance was rewarded by survival and safety, while defiance resulted in visibility, pain, and exclusion. Even as devices evolved, the principles remained consistent: visibility, documentation, and psychological impact. Iron collars, stocks, wheels, cages, each device created physical suffering and social instruction. Pain was not isolated, it was socialized, transformed into a communal lesson encoded in both body and society. Witnesses understood the consequences. Authorities ensured permanence through record-keeping, and sometimes through visible scarring of the body. The spectacle was the medium through which law, morality, and power communicated. In combining physical punishment, psychological humiliation, and legal procedure, medieval authorities created a system where suffering was calculated, observed, and enduring. Public spectacle was a form of government as much as it was of punishment. The streets, markets, and squares became classrooms. The punished became teachers, and fear became a method of administration. Through these carefully orchestrated displays, law was visible, predictable, and enforceable. The public, the accused, and the chroniclers all participated in a ritual of authority, witnessing the consequences of disobedience while codifying the logic of medieval justice. The streets carried the message that crime was costly, not just in pain, but in shame, status, and legacy. In these performances, the medieval world transformed human suffering into social currency, ensuring obedience through spectacle and memory.
The man who once hung from ropes, endured the rack, and faced fire, now knew that humiliation itself was a weapon. The public eye, the communal judgment, and the permanent marks left on body and soul completed the cycle of control. The spectacle of shame demonstrated that authority could not only injure, but also manipulate perception, morality, and memory, turning punishment into a social and legal instrument of unparalleled effectiveness. As medieval punishment evolved, authorities moved beyond temporary pain and public humiliation to a darker, more permanent form of control: mutilation. Where suspension, the rack, and fire inflicted suffering that could heal, mutilation left indelible marks. Limbs, fingers, eyes, and even genitalia became instruments through which law, morality, and social order were enforced. The body itself was transformed into a living document, recording crime, compliance, and authority. Maiming served multiple purposes. First, it punished the individual with lasting disability. Loss of fingers, ears, or hands could prevent the accused from returning to their trade, limiting economic mobility and independence. Second, mutilation produced visible evidence of crime. Townspeople could instantly recognize someone who had stolen, rebelled, or defied the law. Finally, it created social stigma, affecting families and communities. Municipal statutes in Germany, Spain, and Italy detail the use of amputations, branding, and other permanent disfigurements for specific crimes. Legal records often specified which body part should be removed, how the procedure was to be carried out, and how witnesses should verify the act. Osteoarchaeological studies corroborate evidence. In Iberian burial grounds, skeletal remains reveal cut marks on metacarpals, phalanges, and long bones consistent with deliberate amputation. Sharp, clean cuts suggest careful surgical action rather than battlefield trauma. Healing patterns indicate that some victims survived for years after mutilation, living with permanent disability. These skeletal traces align with surviving court records and municipal inventories, which list instruments such as thumbscrews, iron rings, and knives explicitly for punitive use. Genital punishment was among the most extreme methods, targeting reproductive organs to assert control over lineage, morality, and social order. Castration, penile amputation, or genital branding appears in civic, military, and ecclesiastical records, particularly in Southern Europe. These acts were rarely accidental. They were calculated to inflict permanent physical, social, and legal consequences. The repercussions extended beyond the individual. Castration could alter inheritance lines, disrupt family structures, and serve as a deterrent to others. Chronicles and trial records note both the application of these punishments and the bureaucratic oversight involved, showing the integration of the practice into formal justice systems. Surgical expertise often intersected with punitive practices.
Surgeons were sometimes present during amputations or genital mutilations to ensure survival, prevent infection, or complete sentences. Treatises from the period discuss the risks and techniques, revealing an uneasy but deliberate collaboration between medicine and the penal system. Sharp cut marks on skeletal remains, along with osteoarchaeological evidence of infection and healing, demonstrate that the boundary between healing and harm was thin. Surgeons became both agents of care and instruments of the law, blurring ethical lines for the sake of administrative control. Other forms of mutilation extended to sensory organs. Blinding, ear removal, and tongue excision were codified in Byzantine, Germanic, and Italian legal codes. Chroniclers describe the public application of these punishments, sometimes to individuals convicted of theft, betrayal, or moral transgression. The consequences were immediate and long-lasting. Loss of sight, speech, or hearing permanently altered the victim's social and economic capabilities. These acts transformed the human body into a visible ledger of crime and obedience, embedding social lessons in flesh and bone. Legal and administrative records show careful regulation. Not all crimes warranted extreme mutilation. Statutes specified precise procedures and acceptable limits. Municipal inventories and executioner logs indicate the instruments maintained for these acts, including knives, chisels, and specialized clamps. Orders for tools, payments to craftsmen, and records of surgical attendants underscore the bureaucratic integration of mutilation into the justice system. Torture and maiming were not spontaneous acts of cruelty. They were deliberate, codified, and administered according to the law. The combination of psychological terror and permanent injury amplified compliance. Victims often confessed or recanted under the threat of mutilation alone, demonstrating an early understanding of the mind-body connection in punishment. Chroniclers recorded cases in which the mere threat of losing fingers, eyes, or genitalia induced obedience, illustrating how terror, anticipation, and spectacle were leveraged alongside instruments of injury. Physical pain alone was insufficient. Authorities combined it with the psychological knowledge that the body could be permanently marked. Mutilation also intersected with public spectacle, creating a triple-layered strategy. The body suffered, witnesses observed, and records documented the act. Municipal statutes often required public visibility, ensuring that mutilated individuals were displayed to the community. Skeletons exhumed from peripheral or unconsecrated burial grounds suggest that some victims were socially segregated after their punishment. The law was thus encoded in 3 dimensions: flesh, society, and archival record. In cases of sexualized punishment, the stakes were particularly high. Witch trials, heresy investigations, and moral courts employed threats or acts of genital mutilation to extract confessions or enforce moral compliance. Legal texts and trial records emphasize control both over the body and the narrative of crime, linking physical suffering to ideological objectives. Osteoarchaeological evidence, though limited, shows patterns of trauma that correspond to these practices, reinforcing the alignment of text and material culture. The long-term consequences of mutilation were profound. Individuals faced permanent disability, social stigma, and economic limitation. Families suffered reputational damage and exclusion from civic participation. Legal codification, procedural oversight, and bureaucratic documentation ensured that these punishments were not random but systematic, creating a reproducible framework for controlling bodies, behavior, and social perception. The man who had once endured suspension, the rack and fire, now confronted a deeper threat: the permanent alteration of his body. Mutilation represented a step beyond temporary suffering, into lifelong consequences, a transformation that extended law into anatomy. Pain was no longer fleeting, it was a permanent record. Authority inscribed itself directly onto the human form, intertwining justice, morality, and social hierarchy in ways that would resonate across communities and generations. This chapter reveals the calculated nature of medieval corporal punishment, a continuum from temporary agony to permanent disability, each stage designed to reinforce authority, enforce compliance, and communicate legal power. Through the integration of surgical knowledge, administrative oversight, and public spectacle, mutilation became a sophisticated instrument of control, demonstrating how the body itself was transformed into law, morality, and social pedagogy.
The human mind can be as vulnerable as the human body. Medieval authorities recognized this, even if they lacked modern psychological terminology. They understood that fear, isolation, and deprivation could be as coercive as blades, ropes, or fire. The evolution of punishment extended beyond physical torment into the realms of darkness, silence, and sensory manipulation. In these chambers, the body remained captive, but the mind became the primary target. Prisons, dungeons, and monastic cells were often small, windowless, and devoid of comfort. Archaeological excavations of castle keeps and fortified administrative compounds reveal pits, narrow chambers, and basement cells designed to hold prisoners in near-complete isolation. Human remains found in these contexts show signs of malnutrition, scurvy, and skeletal growth retardation, reflecting prolonged deprivation. Documentary sources, including monastic chronicles and municipal records, detail the conditions. Prisoners confined for days or weeks with minimal food, water, or light. The purpose was clear: to weaken the will, break resistance, and compel confession. Isolation alone was an effective tool. Rulebooks like the Regular Benedicti provided context for structured confinement, while secular courts adopted similar practices. Extended solitude produced fear, anxiety, and eventually hallucination. Prisoners reported disorientation, trembling, and desperation. Letters preserved from the 16th century describe the terror of endless darkness and the psychological erosion caused by enforced silence. Chroniclers noted that some confessions emerged not from physical pain, but from the overwhelming psychological strain of isolation. Sensory deprivation was often combined with other punishments. The prisoner might be hooded, chained, or bound in a manner that restricted movement while cutting off visual and auditory input. Executioner ledgers and municipal inventories list hoods, sacks, and other devices explicitly for this purpose. Contemporary medical observers describe the physiological effects: rapid heartbeat, hyperventilation, anxiety, and fainting. The mind, deprived of normal stimuli, became increasingly suggestible. Authorities used this suggestibility to extract confessions, sometimes requiring only minimal physical coercion. In other cases, sensory overload was employed. Prisoners could be exposed to sudden bright light in the middle of the night, loud noises, or abrupt temperature changes. Correspondence and ambassadorial reports from the late 16th century describe these techniques in detail. Constant illumination, exposure to cold water, or unpredictable environmental stressors. The goal was to destabilize perception, fatigue the mind, and magnify fear, creating a psychological vulnerability that complemented physical torture. Victims often experienced panic, confusion, and acute stress responses. Sleep deprivation emerged as a particularly potent method. Letters and trial records indicate that prisoners were sometimes prevented from resting for days, the absence of sleep amplifying both physical pain and mental anguish. Physiological studies and contemporary medical texts explain that lack of sleep heightens pain perception,
reduces cognitive resistance, and increases the likelihood of false confessions. Officials recognize these effects, intentionally combining them with other coercive measures to maximize compliance. The consequences of sensory deprivation were severe and long-lasting. Osteoarchaeological surveys of dungeons reveal chronic stress markers, growth disruptions, and even bone changes indicative of prolonged immobilization. Survivors reported long-term anxiety, insomnia, and heightened susceptibility to suggestion. The effects were cumulative. Isolation weakened both body and mind, setting the stage for confession or recantation. The administration of deprivation was, in effect, a psychological science. Officials calibrated duration, intensity, and timing to extract information while preserving the prisoner's life. These techniques demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of human vulnerability. Torturers learned to manipulate perception, timing, and environment to control behavior. Unlike physical methods, which left visible evidence, psychological methods were invisible yet powerful. They produced confessions, compliance, and terror without necessarily causing lasting bodily harm. The record suggests that officials valued these approaches for their efficiency and subtlety. A broken mind could be as useful as a broken body for generating testimony. Public and private effects were intertwined. Prisoners subjected to sensory deprivation often emerged compliant, fearful, and socially subdued. Their confessions reinforced legal authority and were recorded meticulously in municipal registers, inquisitorial protocols, and court dockets. Archaeological traces, combined with textual evidence, show that these methods were standardized, procedural, and deliberate. Psychological torture was not haphazard. It was integrated into a broader system of interrogation, social control, and bureaucratic documentation. Some strategies combined psychological and physical elements. Bastinado, or foot whipping, illustrates this hybrid approach. Travel accounts, hospital records, and coroner reports describe repetitive strikes to the soles, producing both immediate pain and long-term nerve damage. Often paired with binding, hooding, or deprivation, these methods compounded suffering, exploiting both body and mind. Osteoarchaeological evidence shows distal tibial periostitis and skeletal deformities consistent with prolonged peripheral trauma. These injuries reveal the careful orchestration of pain to maximize effect while controlling the risk of death. The cumulative logic of sensory deprivation and psychological torture became clear over time. A sequence of stressors, applied with precision, could break resistance systematically. Officials recorded confessions, noted reactions, and adjusted procedures accordingly. Manuals, letters, and municipal instructions demonstrate deliberate experimentation with duration, intensity, and combination of methods. Torture evolved from crude physicality into an administrative and psychological discipline. In essence, the medieval justice system developed a dual strategy. The body could be harmed and the mind could be manipulated. Sensory deprivation, sleep disruption, and environmental stressors were tools as deliberate as the rack or branding iron. Authorities recognized the efficiency of the mind as a target and refined techniques to exploit its vulnerabilities. These methods highlight a chilling understanding. Compliance could be achieved not only through physical destruction, but through psychological calibration, anticipation, and fear. By combining isolation, sensory deprivation, and physical coercion, officials created an ecosystem of control in which prisoners' bodies were constrained and their minds systematically broken. The results were confessions, social lessons, and the preservation of authority. Skeletons from dungeon contexts, chronicler accounts, and archival protocols converged to demonstrate the effectiveness and methodical nature of these practices. The man who had survived suspension, the rack, fire, and mutilation now confronted an invisible enemy. His own mind, weakened by deprivation, fear, and anticipation. Here, authority reached beyond flesh, extending into cognition, perception, and willpower. Sensory deprivation represents the evolution of torture from physical coercion into psychological mastery, a reminder that control is often most effective when unseen, cumulative, and enduring. In the broader context of medieval justice, these methods marked a critical innovation: the administration of fear and obedience without immediate lethality, preparing prisoners for confession and submission while minimizing the risk of permanent death. They demonstrate an early, systematic understanding of the mind-body connection, revealing that medieval authorities wielded both the tangible and intangible to assert control.
As the medieval period progressed, the administration of punishment became increasingly sophisticated. Pain and terror were no longer left to chance or the individual discretion of executioners. Instead, violence became codified, standardized, and bureaucratically managed. By this stage, the instruments of torture, the sequence of infliction, and the documentation of confessions were fully integrated into a legal and administrative system. The body, mind, and record were unified into a single mechanism of control, producing not just immediate compliance, but enduring social, legal, and historical consequences. Central to this development was the meticulous documentation of punishment. Municipal and inquisitorial archives, from Spain to Italy, preserve procedural volumes detailing arrests, interrogations, confessions, and executions. Executioners' ledgers list instruments maintained, repaired, or purchased: racks, hoods, iron collars, thumb screws, branding irons, and specialized clamps. In some cases, these inventories specify the condition, placement, and intended use of each device. The precision reflects a bureaucratic logic. Torture was no longer ad hoc, but a predictable, repeatable procedure, accountable to both civic and ecclesiastical authorities. These records reveal a sophisticated understanding of administration and risk. Officials carefully calibrated the severity of punishment to achieve confession without causing unintended death. Surgeons were sometimes present to treat injuries, maintain life, and ensure that the victim could continue to testify. Medical treatises of the period document complications from compression, cutting, or heat, and these were consulted to prevent fatalities. Fiscal records show payments to physicians for post-torture care, highlighting the intersection of law, medicine, and administration. Pain was managed as a resource, meticulously calculated to serve legal ends. Integration of multiple methods became systematic. Physical punishment, mutilation, sensory deprivation, psychological coercion, and public spectacle were combined into procedural sequences. Legal manuals outlined acceptable instruments, techniques, and durations. Inquisition handbooks described straps, suspensions, and progressive escalation of discomfort. Municipal statutes codified stocks, collars, and wheels for public humiliation. The goal was consistency. A prisoner anywhere under centralized authority would experience comparable procedures, producing a standardized record of suffering that could be referenced in court, in archives, and in the civic memory. The bureaucratic codification of pain transformed punishment into a multi-layered instrument of governance. Physical suffering, psychological breakdown, social shaming, and archival documentation intersected. Public display, chronicler accounts, and municipal ledgers created a feedback loop. The inflicted pain became visible evidence of authority, recorded evidence of procedural correctness, and a historical testament to the reach of law. Chroniclers and scribes functioned as witnesses, ensuring that the act of punishment survived beyond the body itself. The legal system thus converted human suffering into proof, into narrative, and into administrative currency.
Osteoarchaeological evidence aligns with this documentary record. Skeletons from cemeteries associated with judicial sites show perimortem and healed injuries consistent with documented techniques. Suspension marks on clavicles, fractures from traction, cut marks from surgical amputation, and pressure injuries from restraint devices. These physical traces demonstrate the reproducibility and predictability of inflicted harm. The human body was effectively a ledger, a tangible document of crime and compliance, confirming that the medieval judicial system managed both flesh and record. Social consequences were as significant as physical ones. Families of victims were often marked by association, losing social status, property, and civic rights. Executed or mutilated bodies were buried in peripheral or unconsecrated graveyards, reinforcing community memory of law and punishment. Public spectacle amplified deterrence. Visibility ensured that the threat of legal consequences extended beyond the individual to the wider population. The integration of punishment into civic life reinforced obedience, moral instruction, and social hierarchy. The codification of torture also enabled innovation and experimentation. Standardized instruments and procedures allowed officials to refine techniques over time. Manuals and administrative correspondence reveal experiments in timing, combination, and escalation of pain. Chemical irritants, thermal exposure, compression devices, and sensory deprivation methods were tested and incorporated into procedural frameworks. The iterative process created a body of knowledge about human physiology, psychology, and compliance, though employed for control rather than healing. Medieval authorities were, in effect, early students of pain management for administrative ends. The cumulative effect of these practices was profound. Torture became a normalized component of law. Confessions obtained under coercion were legally valid. Procedural records validated both the act and the testimony. Social, economic, and familial repercussions extended the impact beyond the individual, embedding compliance into the very structure of community and governance. Human suffering was codified into administrative language, fiscal expenditure, and bureaucratic oversight, ensuring that the consequences of crime were tangible, durable, and enforceable. Importantly, the archive of pain survived beyond the victims themselves. Confessions, inventories, execution records, and chronicler accounts provide modern historians with a multidimensional view of medieval justice. Skeletal remains corroborate documentary evidence, creating a convergent testimony that allows reconstruction of both technique and intent. From suspension to psychological manipulation, from branding to surgical mutilation, the convergence of text and material culture demonstrates deliberate, systematic, and institutionalized use of suffering as governance. The legal system's transformation of pain into record reflects a deeply sophisticated understanding of authority. By merging physical coercion with procedural rigor and documentation, officials achieved multiple objectives: extraction of confessions, reinforcement of civic norms, deterrence through visibility, and preservation of historical memory. Pain was weaponized, socialized, and recorded, forming a continuum from immediate suffering to enduring administrative artifact. In this context, the man who endured every form of medieval torture, suspension, the rack, fire, mutilation, sensory deprivation, becomes emblematic. His body and experiences were mapped, documented, and encoded into law and record. His suffering was deliberate, calculated, and integrated into a system designed not only to punish, but to control, instruct, and memorialize. The intersection of physical pain, psychological manipulation, and bureaucratic recording represents the apex of medieval strategies of governance by terror. The culmination of these practices offers a stark lesson. Legal authority, when combined with meticulous procedure, can transform cruelty into a tool of administration. Instruments, manuals, archives, and bones collectively narrate a story of a society that institutionalized suffering. This legacy endures in the historical record, challenging modern observers to confront the mechanics of power, the ethics of legal control, and the ways in which human pain can be codified, standardized, and utilized as an instrument of governance. Through the integration of all these methods, medieval societies created a system in which punishment was multidimensional: physical, psychological, social, and bureaucratic. The meticulous orchestration of instruments, sequences, and documentation ensured that authority was both visible and recordable. Bodies, minds, and archives became interdependent instruments of control, producing compliance, memory, and social order. The archive of pain thus preserves not just the history of suffering, but the logic of governance itself, revealing how law, administration, and human suffering were interwoven into a single, formidable apparatus.